Welcome to the Model Systems Knowledge Translation Center webinar on how Bibliometrics can support model systems research, an overview of citation measures and their use. My name is Delphinia Brown, and I'll be your host for this event. I organize technical assistance and training for the Model Systems Knowledge Translation Center, or MSKTC. This webinar addresses one of the MSKTC's goals to strengthen the knowledge translation work of the NIDLR Model Systems grantees. Bibliometric measures can provide insights into the impact of your knowledge translation work and the implementation of strategies that encourage and influence the effective use of research-based healthcare. Ricky Mangrum is a bibliometrics expert and enthusiast who will lead the discussion for us today. Ricky is a senior research scientist at the American Institutes for Research and a colleague. She directs studies in the fields of healthcare-related measurement, patient and stakeholder engagement, and post-acute and long-term care. She has conducted bibliometric analysis studies for the MSKTC, as well as for the National Institutes for Nursing Research and the National Institutes of Health. She serves as chair of the Quality Measures Subcommittee for the Society for Post-Acute and Long-Term Care Medicine, AMDA, and is a subject matter expert for the NQF Measures Applications Partnerships Post-Acute and Long-Term Care Work Group. She also serves as an editor for the Qualitative Report, which is a leading peer-reviewed journal focused on qualitative methodology. We are fortunate to have Ricky with us today for this discussion on bibliometric measures. So without further delay, I turn the mic over to Ricky to get us started.
Thank you all so much for joining today. Thank you, Delphinia, for that kind introduction. Really pleased to be able to talk about bibliometrics. It's an underutilized source of information and insight into scholarly communication. And so it's exciting to have an opportunity to talk about it with people from the Model Systems programs. To give you a sense of what I'll cover today, there's some learning objectives here on this slide. So I'll address what bibliometrics are, how they're used, how they could be used by individuals or programs like the Model System programs, and then I will talk about where you can access these bibliometrics. And although I will be focusing on the Web of Science system in terms of delving in to show you exactly how these things work, it's not the only option that is available. So simply put, bibliometrics applies quantitative methods to analyze citation patterns across publications, such as looking at who cites whom, where articles are published, and whether there are patterns among authors who co-author or co-cite each other's work. And so to get us started, I thought it might be helpful for me to ask you to reflect on why you cite other people's work in your publications, whether it's a journal or a book or a white paper or some other publication. I know we don't have all that many people on the call, but there's multiple options. So please go ahead and select all that apply. I'm going to turn it over to Deirdre to bring up a poll for us.
I believe Deirdre might be having trouble loading.
Okay, I see her shaking her head at me, so perhaps we're having further technological problems that can't be solved by a quick unmute.
I think it'd be okay if we just type into the chat.
Yeah, if you can type into the chat maybe one or two reasons why you've cited someone else's work when you were publishing. Okay, gives credibility to your work. Excellent. For context, yes, absolutely. And I think some other reasons that we often cite work because we're providing evidence for a claim or because we're quoting someone else. We could be referencing another study as evidence, or we could be quoting somebody's insight into data that they've collected. Another common reason for citing work is that we're referring to a specific theory or a methodology. I see James has just added methodology. And those things are sometimes explained more fully elsewhere. And so it's sort of a shorthand. Providing context or background information is very common. Many articles and many books contain literature review sections exactly for that purpose. Background and context could also include references to articles that describe problems or describe standard operating procedures at a type of facility or a government agency. Sometimes we cite something because we're identifying a problem with that work, or we want to comment in some way on a study's scope or its quality. And then often our work rests on a body of prior work, and we may reference some or all of it as an acknowledgement. And that's not a comprehensive list by any means, but it does give a sense of the range of reasons that people cite each other. And these practices of citing, which are common across many fields of communication, scholarly communication, are the foundation for citation analysis. So how do bibliometrics work? So although interest in bibliometrics has actually increased somewhat in the past few years, which I think is partly due to the ease of accessing systems that provide these metrics, the science itself is actually quite old. It dates back to the 1950s when journal publishers first began using computers to control their publication records. And back then, the Institute for Scientific Information, or ISI, was established. It was established in 1961, and they began to use basic statistical formulas as well as some specialized ones to illuminate trends and patterns in citations among publications that were included in their indexes. These formulas commonly examine things like frequency and co-occurrence, as well as other relationships among citations. But bibliometric science is based on the assumption that citation reflects value or importance or impact or whatever you might call it. And that doesn't mean that people necessarily agree with every finding of every paper that they cite, or even think that every study they cite is of high quality. Some people do talk about bibliometrics from time to time as though they were quality measures, and they really aren't, and I can't emphasize that enough. For example, as I noted a little bit earlier, literature might be cited because you're disputing it or you're critiquing it. And so this is a very important caveat when thinking about what importance or impact means in bibliometric terms. It doesn't always mean good or better. And finally, bibliometrics reflect the patterns of citation, which are different for humanities and hard sciences, for example. So they reflect the norms of scholarly communication within each subfield. In some fields, key research is published in book form, for example, while in others, it's disseminated principally through academic meetings. That's very common, for example, for mathematics. And this means that we can adjust bibliometric scoring to reflect the norms in each field, or even each journal, to achieve better measurement of impact. And we can also normalize these metrics in ways that allow us to compare them when we're doing work in a multidisciplinary field. So at the most fundamental level, bibliometrics help you describe the ways that publications are used by looking at how individual papers get cited. To answer basic questions like, how often was my paper cited, or does my work get cited more or less often than my peers? But this information can be used to understand something about the impact or value of a specific publication or study. At the same time, you can look beyond the simple measure of did it get cited and by whom. For example, you can look at where the citing articles were published. Were they mostly in journals in the same field, or did they come from a variety of fields? And this could tell you something about the penetration of a specific study into other disciplines. You could look at trends over time to see whether a study seems to be of lasting importance or increasing importance over time. This gives you a sense of some of the breadth of uses. And as you collect more data about groups of individual publications, you can start to tackle bigger questions. For example, you can not only look at the impact of a specific study, you can start to look at sets of studies. The MSKTC, for example, has looked at bibliometrics to help understand how model systems research publication and uptake of systematic reviews occurs. You can also use the metrics to understand something about journal quality within a set of publications. For example, we might want to understand whether research in a topic area or from a particular research program is being accepted for publication in high-quality journals. Or we might want to look at this over time to understand whether a maturing research program is being accepted into better quality journals later in its life than early on. Or you might want to use bibliometric data to understand the ways in which work in a specific topic area is conducted by or influenced by groups of researchers. All of these same metrics can be useful on an individual level as well. For example, as someone seeking funding or someone contemplating research on a specific topic, one might like to know whether the research funding program is having an impact. Are people citing the constituent studies? Or are there patterns to those citations that can tell you anything about uptake or impact? Or you could use it to supplement a search for a potential journal to publish in or for research partners to work with, which is an increasingly common practice. There are a variety of places where you can find these types of measures. You can even find the most basic measure, the number of times something has been cited on Google Scholar, for example. Web of Science, which is operated by Clarivate Analytics now. We have Scopus and Eigenfactor. These are larger systems that provide multiple metrics. Many of the resources that provide these types of metrics require a subscription, and many are available at most academic institutions. And public institutions will often allow visitors to use these resources on site in the library, or a librarian can conduct a search for you. Others, like Eigenfactor, are free, but they often include fewer metrics to choose from. And I did want to just quickly mention that there are similar metrics used for other types of data about usage, such as how often a full text article is viewed online or downloaded or even talked about on Twitter. And these are called alt metrics. I'm not going to delve into these today, but I did want to mention them and just list a few resources that you can use, such as OpenRefine or Cite2Tool and Gephi. So here I wanted to give just a very quick overview of how the MSKTC has been using these metrics. So these are some of the questions that we've posed and used Bibliometrics to help answer. So these methods help the MSKTC support the model systems in understanding publication and citation patterns that can shed light on whether the research is having its intended impacts. So for example, as I alluded to earlier, the MSKTC looked at metrics for systematic reviews carried out by model system program researchers. And what we found was that, yes, the studies were being published in high-quality journals and that the quality appeared to be improving over time. We were also able to see that articles were being cited within the expected fields, but also reaching an audience that might not have been anticipated. And we were also able to see some interesting trends in citation over time. And we'll see a little bit more of this as we go through the next section of the webinar. But I did want to just stop here for a moment to see if there are any questions. I don't see any. Is that right?
That's right. At this point, there doesn't seem to be any questions in the chat or the Q&A. But just a reminder to everyone, you can type questions for Ricky as she's speaking. I'll be monitoring the questions.
Okay, great. And so Bibliometrics includes a really wide variety of measures, way more than I can fit on a slide. But I did want to just highlight a few of the most commonly used ones. These include the principal article level metric of the number of times an article has been cited. But it's important to remember that this particular metric can be calculated in a variety of ways, such as times cited over a given period of time, or with or without citations by the same author, or with or without citations that appeared in the same journal, and so on. There are researcher metrics, such as how many citations a specific researcher receives on average for their work, or metrics that allow you to see networks of co-authors or people who cite each other often. And there are also journal metrics. There's actually more journal metrics than there are the other kinds of metrics. These include the journal impact factor, which is a pretty widely known one. And that's a measure of the average number of citations articles in that specific journal receive over a 1-year or could be a 5-year period. These metrics also include journal rankings and quartiles, which compare levels of citation for journals that are classified within the same subject field. For example, you could look at journals just within rehabilitation medicine. There's also something called the article influence score, which is a statistical estimate of the average influence of a journal's articles over the first 5 years of publication. Another metric is the immediacy index, which is the average number of times an article is cited in the same year that it is published. And this assesses whether the journal is sort of cutting edge or successfully publishing in hot topics, which can be of great interest for certain types of researchers. And because the immediacy index is a per article average, it tends to discount the advantage that large journals have over small ones, which can be a problem with some of these other metrics. I'd be curious to know if any of you have actually used any of these metrics for any reason at any time. So if you have, if you could just type so into the chat, that would be terrific. So these measures can be applied at different levels. So the individual applications might include finding out which of my studies that I did get cited, who is citing my work, or it could be who are the most cited researchers in my field, or you could be curious what happened to researchers that I worked with 5, 10, or 30 years ago. And finally, what journal should I consider publishing in? I see that James has indicated that's something that he has done. And promotion and tenure, this is another really common use for these metrics. At the program or sort of institutional level, these measures can be calculated on sets of articles or journals or researchers. So this could be for something like model systems. It could also be done for an academic department or research institution, or you could even look at all studies coming out of a particular funder, like the CDC, for a time period that you were interested in. And when you are evaluating a program or a group of articles and publications, these are some of the core things that Bibliometrics can help you understand. So as a group, how many citations do model system studies receive? And what do those patterns of citation tell us about the uptake of the work? Is it driven, for example, by a few very heavily cited studies, or is it spread very evenly over all of the different publications? How long does it usually take for citations to begin? This can be a characteristic that's very specific not only to a field, but to specific topics within a field. And then finally, as we've noted before, taking a look at the quality of journals that are publishing the articles themselves or in which citing articles are being published. So article metrics can help you understand these characteristics of research uptake over time and within different fields. And it's important content for understanding uptake in scholarly communication within any given specialized topic area. For example, if we delved into it, we might be able to illuminate with Bibliometrics whether studies in one model system are taken up more quickly than in another, and then we might be able to investigate why that happened. Another area in which a lot of my work has focused is who else is using this work? What other fields of medicine or health are using the results of the studies, which may have been funded for a very specific reason? Bibliometric individuals available for individual journals can help you understand whether the research is getting published in journals that are in the right fields, where your primary intended audience is likely to find them. This is often of interest to the funder or administrator of a research program. For example, model systems programs might like to see that their studies are being published in journals that focus on rehabilitation, but they also might like to see that there is penetration into other fields like internal medicine or dermatology or surgery. And no presentation on a research would be complete without caveats or limitations. And when using bibliometrics, context is crucial, and I always caution people to be very thoughtful in how they use these measures. And why? Well, for one thing, citation practices do vary a great deal from field to field and over time. So 15 citations in 5 years might be a very, very high number for one field and a very, very low number in another. So you can't just look at a number 15 and say, oh, that's good. Many citations do not necessarily mean that the study is of high quality, and low citations don't mean that the researcher who conducted the work is of low importance. Journal quality changes a lot over time. Journals expand and contract to cover or eliminate subject areas, and that can affect these metrics. And finally, bibliometric systems actually implement the formulas a little bit differently, so you can't compare apples and oranges there without some thought as well. And all of these factors affect these metrics and how you think about using them. So one caution that I always give is that a single citation-based measure is not really useful and doesn't necessarily fairly represent the item or the underlying literature. These are best used in sets, and they're best used alongside other evaluative strategies. So in Google Scholar, for example, Darwin's Origin of Species has only about 49,000 citations, which is considerably less than a paper by Lowry et al. Entitled Protein Measurement with the Folin Phenol Reagent, which has been cited more than 200,000 times. So that's an instance in which we might not want to use that number to say that the Lowry paper is more important than Darwin's Origin of Species. Similarly, despite being withdrawn 12 years after it was published in The Lancet, Andrew Wakefield's paper linking autism to the measles vaccine has been cited more than 3,300 times, and there are continuing citations to that paper reflecting its importance as a problematic publication. So these are reasons why relying on a single metric alone is generally a bad idea. But sets of bibliometric measures can be helpful, especially in the presence of other contextual information. For example, knowing that an article has 50 citations is not all that useful, but consider this alternative. You know that an article that was published in a top-ranked journal has 55 citations in the first year of publication in a field where the average article actually only receives 2 citations within the first year. This begins to tell you more clearly that this article was important in some way. Finally, research shows that bibliometrics work best when peer-reviewed literature is used. So this form of scholarly communication is more formalized than, say, conference proceedings or white papers or even books, and thus it provides a robust set of data for analysis. And although you can obtain metrics on these other forms of publications, studies have suggested that the results are not as consistently reliable as they are for journals that are peer-reviewed. Okay, and any questions?
I don't see any questions in the chat or Q&A, but I just want to remind those who joined a little bit late that at any point you can submit questions for Ricky about the topic in the chat and Q&A, and we'll pause periodically to answer those questions.
Okay, so I'm going to walk through one system in a little bit of detail, the Web of Science, which certainly has its foibles, which is one of the reasons why I'm going to use slides and not attempt a live demonstration of the database. The Web of Science is, however, widely considered to be sort of a gold standard for bibliometrics, and I believe that it still has the largest array of available metrics and covers the largest span of time with its database. Still, these systems are constantly growing and evolving. Web of Science has changed the look and feel of its platform several times in the past 18 months to 2 years. So my caveat on the statement about the number of metrics and the span of time is subject to change without notice. What you're looking at here on this slide is the base page for the Web of Science, which includes a number of resources, as you can see across the very top, and in this drop-down box here in blue. So if you have access to this database, it's worth exploring these other resources further. For example, the Essential Science Indicators, a very interesting set of metrics about different science fields. But I'm just going to focus on 2 components today that are circled up here at the top, the Web of Science itself and the journal citation reports. So typically, when you start, you're typically looking up a single article to see its metrics. So here is an article that I selected pretty much at random from a model systems study systematic review published just about 10 years ago by Corrigan Wagner et al. On traumatic brain injury. So when you look up this title, this is what you will see on the screen. Over on the right here, circled in red, you can see the times cited and a usage count. And over on the left here where this red arrow is, you can see in this pane a variety of information about this article. For example, it does identify that it's a review. And if the full image would fit on the slide, you could see the organizations, such as the University of Washington that was associated with the study, as well as the funder, which was NIDLR, but at the time this article was published, it was actually NIDRR, so if we scrolled down and looked at it, that's the name that you would see. These mechanisms over here in this left pane are very important for doing some of the analyses that I referred to earlier, such as looking at relationships among organizations or networks of researchers who have similar funding. Also listed here are the Web of Science categories or topics that pertain to this item's content. But let's go back over here to the right. In this pane, you can see that the article has been cited 13 times. Importantly, that means it's 13 times by articles that are in the Web of Science core collection. So the Web of Science system itself indexes about 6,600, 6,700 journals across a pretty wide variety of disciplines, but it certainly doesn't have everything. It also has this usage count of 7. What this tells you is how many individual users of the Web of Science system have clicked through to the full text or downloaded this citation into a program like EndNote from a display like this. Now, if you click on the journal title that you see on that initial screen, you can see a pop-up box with basic information about the journal that the item was published in. The impact factors are there, along with rankings from the journal citation reports. What I want you to note here is that this information is actually from 2013. This can be an important little detail to pay attention to. In this case, it's because the journal has changed names and it's now the Journal of Trauma and Acute Care Surgery. So what the system will show you is the name of the journal at the time that the article was published and the most recent information that it has for that exact title. If you wanted to follow up and know how this journal was doing now, you'd need to look up under its current name. Another couple of things to dig into regarding the information in this pop-up box is that you see there is a 1-year impact factor and a 5-year impact factor, and that they're different. So you might recall the impact factor is the average number of citation that recent articles in the journal receive, and the Web of Science defines recent as the most recent 2-year period, even though they call it a 1-year impact factor. And then 5 years is the period covered by the 5-year factor. So you might wonder why 2 years? Well, that's because such a small percentage of articles actually do get cited right away that if you only use the most recent year, you'd have less data to work with and the results would be less reliable. So the JCR, the Journal Citation Reports, sets the 1-year impact factor as encompassing data from the past, most recent 2 years. Now, typically, the 5-year impact factor is higher than the 1 year, and sometimes it's a lot higher, but not always. Some journals do get short-term, but not longer-term citations. So these two scores taken together can tell you something about the way that journal fits in its field. When the number is a lot higher, it can tell you something about the field itself. For example, it could indicate something about the pace of research or the pace of publication, such as when journals take a long time to accept and actually publish articles. The other thing you see is that this journal has been assigned to 3 different fields of science, and that they have different rankings and quartiles. So here right away, you can see why you might want to look at a couple of bibliometrics rather than just one. For example, here we can see how a claim of a top 10 journal in one field might mean as much as the claim of a top 40 journal in another. So emergency medicine, ranked as number 3 out of 25, is quarter 1, but the journal Surgery, ranked number 31 out of 204, is also a quartile 1 journal, excuse me. Now, when you click on that number of times cited, where it said number 13, you can actually access a list of the articles that cited the original item that you looked up. And here you can see that this article, which was published about 10 years ago, was cited as recently as 1 year ago. Over here in the left pane, you can access, again, various types of information, including a list of the fields that these items fall into. This gives you a sense of the topical reach for the original item. So here we can see many journals in clinical neurology and rehabilitation, but also substance abuse, which might be an interesting addition to the uptake of this particular study. If you kept scrolling down on that pane, you can see a lot of other information, such as the organizations and funding organizations for the articles that cited the original item. And one item to pay attention to here down at the bottom is the list of the top citing authors. And here, this actually includes two of the original authors, Corrigan and Bogner. These two individuals, in citing their own work, actually account for 30% of those 13 citations that this article received. Now, self-citation is something that we pay attention to in Bibliometrics, but there are a lot of reasons why people cite their own work. So self-citation isn't a good or bad practice. It's just something that you might want to take into account when you're interpreting results. For example, if what you were mostly interested in is uptake by other people, you might want to round down that number of 13 a little bit in understanding the impact of this particular article. Another observation that we can make here in this pane is that we see a reference to a veterinary organization up here. We also see a reference to the Australian Research Council. So these are the sorts of things that could be interesting indicators of the article's reach. It could also just be coincidence, but it gives you a sense of the kinds of things to pay attention to and follow up on. Now, if we go back to the original article display, we can click on this button here for Create Citation Report. And when you do that, what you will get is a display that looks like this. This is an overview of the citation report, and it provides most of the same information you just saw, but it charts it out, and it can often be an easier way to absorb and assess this information. And I find this very helpful in anytime I'm looking at something where I want to understand trends over time. And this could be trends in how many times an article was cited, like the middle line here, or it could be trends in the publication dates of articles that were cited. So if you think about this in terms of the systematic review example, if I'm looking at a systematic review and trying to understand quality and impact, one of the things I might like to see is the trend in the publication dates of the studies that were included in the review itself. If there was an odd-looking clustering, let's say there were 8 articles 40 years ago and then nothing, and then 9 articles recently, then I might want to dig in a little deeper to understand why that happened. Is that really just how the research fell out, or did somehow the person who conducted the systematic review miss a large body of evidence in the intervening years? Another thing I wanted to mention is that these reports, all of the things that you've seen on the screen, can be downloaded, and they can be downloaded both as sort of this graphical display, or they can be downloaded in Excel spreadsheets. One other thing that I want to draw your attention to here is when we look at this report for this single article, it gives us citing articles and articles without self-citations, and you'll notice that it indicates that there aren't any, but we know that there are. I have never seen this particular function work correctly on the Web of Science when you look up a single article. It does work correctly when you look up a set of articles, either ones that you've input yourself, or maybe you've looked up all of the articles by a specific by a specific author. All right, so let me move on to talking about looking at sets of articles. So back on this basic search page where you had put in your title or other search criteria to find an individual article, you'll notice this function of marked list up here on the right. This function allows you to look up and save a set of articles. So, for example, I looked up systematic reviews from the model system programs, or you could look up all of the articles that have been published from a particular study, or from a specific group of researchers, or from a particular funding program, or an academic department, or whatever other criteria might apply to your group. And then you can look at similar metrics for the whole set. Now, to use this marked list function, you do need to register for an account with Clarivate, and that is free. Having the account allows you to maintain and manage sets of marked lists. So you can have I've never exceeded a number, so I don't actually know if there's a cap. This allows you to keep marked lists, and you can update analysis from time to time. For example, if you are associated with a research program and you're publishing every year, you could add new articles to this every year and rerun your analysis. You can also save these pretty much indefinitely. So there's a whole bunch of work here that I did in 2017 for the MSKTC. Perhaps in a year or two, we'll revisit this analysis to see what has changed in the interim. So to create a marked list, you would look up individual items, and when you have them on the screen, you can click this button that says Add to Marked List. If you're looking up a group of items, you can use functions like Select Page, or you can click boxes next to individual articles and to select them, and then click this button. You can then name your marked list and add it to your library. And here you can see the citation report for a marked set. And this allows you, again, to look at trends over time, think about average citations for the set, what are the total cumulative citations for the set, and here we can also see the working self-citation function. So that the total number of citing articles is 1,286, but we knock out 20 odd there for self-citations. Now, a report like this can reveal a variety of interesting findings. For example, here we see increasing levels of citation over time, but with sort of various blips and dips, which can reflect things like waves of attention to a topic over time. It could also be waves of research. Sometimes trends can be correlated with waves of research funding, or even with foundational discoveries that change a particular scientific field, such as a new treatment or discovery of a new biomarker. Another thing that can be done with lists is to map out the co-authoring relationships, which, as you can see, can be very complex and don't necessarily show up very well on a webinar slide. But it does allow you to sort of very quickly pick out several authors here who appear to be key players. So the size and saturation of the name indicates the number of times the person has been cited. And then it shows you as actual physical entities, groups of researchers who are working and publishing together. This same set of metrics can be applied, for example, to institutional affiliation. So this particular graphic shows affiliations for authors at NIH's Clinical Center's Rehabilitation Medicine Department. We can see what other organizations are collaborating or co-publishing or co-citing with that individual department sitting at the center. Okay, so I'm going to switch now to the Journal Citation Reports, which is the resource that provides journal metrics. It's accessed from that top menu. So over here was the Web of Science, and here's the Journal Citation Reports. And the Journal Citation Reports, or JCR, allows you to access a great deal of information about journals. It's more detailed than what you saw when you clicked on the journal when we clicked on the journal name in that citation and got that pop-up box. Now, there are 3 main points of entry to get into the system. You can browse or look up by journal. You can browse by category. And if you really want to, you can become kind of a power user and you can create your own custom reports. Now, I'm not going to get into that today, but if you become someone who uses uses these metrics a lot, this function can be quite useful. I will also note that regardless of how you go in initially, it is pretty easy to switch between these 3 types of functions once you get going inside the application. So I started by looking up this journal, the Journal of Rehabilitation Research and Development. And this slide shows the top part of a very long report for this journal. At the top here, you can see a lot of sort of basic information about the journal, its international publication number. If you need to get the abbreviation, it's there. It indicates who the publisher is. You can go directly to the journal table of contents from here. It tells you what language it's published in and how often it comes out. Another thing to note up here is an icon for allowing you to download. And here's that icon. This particular folder with the plus sign actually allows you to access any custom report that you have set up. So if you wanted to add this journal to a custom report, you have an icon right there that allows you to do that. Below this basic information where this orange arrow is, you can begin to see part of the year-by-year report for this journal, and this provides a great deal of information. I've mentioned some, but not all of these different metrics that are available, and I did want to draw attention to the fact that you can actually choose to graph out any of these different metrics if you so choose. Some of these other items that are here, I mean, I can't go into all of them. I did want to draw attention to the citable items. However, this tells you the number of items that were citable. In other words, things like letters and editorial opinions are typically not considered citable and wouldn't be included in this count. And this can be an important piece of contextual information when you're understanding why journal metrics or even individual citation metrics fluctuate over time. As you can see from this journal, year on year, there is pretty substantial variation in the number of citable items that they produce. If you scroll down on that same page, we're now looking further down in the years for this same journal, you can see over here there is a number of other types of information that you can access by clicking on these links. I clicked on the ranking information just to pull up this box of information. And this is where you can see the year-by-year ranking for this journal in the field of rehabilitation. If the journal had more than one field, those would simply be listed out in additional columns here. And here, it's also important to notice how much things can fluctuate over time. And as a result, when you're assessing the quality of an article from 2010 by thinking about the quality of the journal it was published in, you'd want to look here to get the information about the time the article was published. So in 2010, this journal was a quartile 1 journal, rather than the most recent year, which happens to be 2016, where it is a quartile 2 journal. Now, as you could with articles, the system allows you to create a list of journals so that you can compare them, but you can only compare up to 15 journals at a time. This can be useful, for example, when you are making decisions about where to publish an article, as well as when you're evaluating the work of institutions or funding programs or groups of researchers. And over here on the left pane, you can see there's quite a lot of different mechanisms available for choosing journals. So you can use this pane to identify specific journals by typing the name in, or you can select according to categories. So you might want to look for journals in a particular topic area that are quartile 1 journals. Note that you can, for example, select only to look at open access journals, which can sometimes be a consideration when you are looking for a place to publish or when you are considering the importance or impact of some articles that you're looking at. One item I wanted to draw attention to here is this select edition area where this red arrow is. This reflects the original way in which this citation information was managed. So SCIE stands for the Science Citation Index Expanded. This was a database that indexed primarily hard sciences and medicine. And SSCI stands for the Social Science Citation Index, which cataloged mainly social science. There is also an Arts and Humanities Citation Index, which is offered through a separate access point in the Web of Science platform. And this background information about how things were originally done is mostly not relevant when you use the Web of Science. But it is important here because when you are not selecting journals by title, you might want to limit yourself to just science or just social science only. Similarly, the system allows you to select countries, journal impact factor quartiles. You can even put in impact factor ranges. And if we scroll down, there are even more options. Looking up at the top of this middle pane here where these purple arrows are, here's where you can see the options for comparing journals. It allows you to use these checkboxes here to select the journals that you want to compare. You can also add journals to a new or existing list, just as you did with articles. You can also customize the indicators that you see in your report. So what I did here was I used the system to pull up all 69 journals that were classified in the field of rehabilitation. So they're listed on the slide. You can't see them all, but if you scroll down, you would. And I can then select a few journals to compare. So perhaps titles that I'm familiar with or that focus on specific topics that interest me. And if you do that, you then come to this dashboard. Over here, you can set the report criteria that you want to look at. So you can go by quartile, or you can look at trends over time. I've selected trends. In this pane, you then select the years that you want to look at, and then you can select characteristics and metrics that you want to look at. So here I've selected to look at the immediacy index just for the most recent 2 years. That was to make a nice slide that, that would be easy to read. And so here we're looking at a trend comparison, and this dashboard, I picked the immediacy index. One of the things that you can do is you can sort of eyeball whether or not there's a journal like this one that seems to be fluctuating year on year versus other ones that maybe stay more or less at the same level. This could be an important piece of information depending on why you are looking up information about the journal. Again, this is one indicator, and I would always recommend considering looking at and comparing multiple indicators to get a better sense of whether a journal is fluctuating up and down in what it publishes, or perhaps changing its scope of publication, and so on and so forth. So that was a quick overview of the core function of Web of Science. So I want to stop and see if there are questions. So it looks like there's a question about whether the maps are done with the Web of Science. Yes, you can generate the maps from the Web of Science. They don't look quite like the ones that I showed on the screen. Those were massaged after the fact with a graphical editor to make them look a little bit prettier. Okay, so that was a lot of detail about how to pull up different indicators. I wanted to share just a few examples of how these can be interpreted and used. So this table here shows an example from an evaluation several years ago that I did for the Patient-Reported Outcome Measurement Information System, or PROMIS. This was a 10-year research program that was funded by the National Institutes for Health, and it generated hundreds of publications. And here we're looking at total citations found for the 148 journals of the many hundreds that were findable in the Web of Science. So we have a nice big number of times cited, getting on towards 2,200, but we can also see that there's a pretty substantial self-citation rate. And for this particular analysis, we didn't just look at self-citation by the same author. We looked at self-citation by any author who was funded by PROMIS. So we could see to what extent the information being published about PROMIS was staying within that network of researchers who already knew about it and were working on it. We also calculated average, median, and range. These can be very important contextual pieces of information to understanding your average. And so through this analysis, we were able to discern that the research program was having a significant impact. We actually didn't worry too much about self-citation rate at the time, simply because the program itself was very large. And given the innovative topic, it seemed normal for there to be quite a bit of cross-citation. However, at the time that the evaluation was done, the PROMIS Network Center began instructing researchers that they might want to consider citing just 1 or 2 articles about the underlying bench science rather than 5 to 10. And that was actually done in response to this self-citation rate. That, maybe it was time after 10 years to start reducing that particular habit. So that's a programmatic use. Oops, I skipped a slide. Here we go. We also looked at article metrics and journal citation information and used them together. We used a technique called normalized citation rate to calculate what was the expected average number of citations for PROMIS publications based on the norms for the fields that were covered by the journals they were publishing in. And what we can see here is a snippet of a table that you can see that in some fields, PROMIS publications were cited far more often than would have been expected. For example, given citation trends, we would have expected PROMIS articles in clinical neurology to receive 3.6 citations on average, but they actually received 11. There were also some fields in which the citation was more or less the same as expected and even lower than expected. So those are some examples of interpreting and using bibliometrics at sort of the programmatic level. But very often when I give these talks, people say, well, what about me? Often you just want to know what the metrics are for yourself or maybe for your research team, and who doesn't want to know more about their own impact and influence. Well, here's me for the period of 2010 to 2020. And when I look myself up, I can see that Web of Science has 8 articles for me, and they've been cited 46 times for an average of 5.75 citations per item. And that seems great. But if you look at this H index, this provides a nice little check on my ego. The H index tells me that of these 8 articles, there were only 2 that received 2 or more citations. So that lets me know that this number of times cited and this average citations per item is actually being driven by 1 or 2 highly cited items. And you can actually see that on the graph here with this spike here at 2017. Either way, this can be a very nice way of sort of quantifying myself, for myself, that my work is having an impact. And again, if you scroll down on this particular display, you can get a lot more detailed information for each individual article that you've published as well. Finally, you might want to know more about your organization. So here I conducted a search for the American Institutes for Research and generated a report. Now, one thing that I will say is that people's institutional affiliations do change, and not all articles actually list them. So this kind of search is at best a pretty good proxy of accurate. But I can still look at this report and see that my organization has a very long history going back to 1950, which is the earliest year covered by this database. Also that the level of citation has been really increasing quite sharply in the last few years. And so I could take this data and I could subdivide it to see what might explain this trend. For example, maybe it's explained by an increase in the kinds of research that's undertaken at this institution, which could indicate a spreading of research foci for a particular organization. Or is it all in one field, which might indicate that research on specific topics is being increased or it's being consolidated within a particular organization. Or again, is it maybe being driven by a selection of very highly cited items? When we look at the H index again, here we see that there are 87 items out of the 15, almost 1,600, that have been cited at least 87 times. Well, that particular H index would explain a minimum of 7,569, or 22% of all of the citations that were given. So again, a good way of using multiple measures to try to understand what is going on here. Okay, so that is a very brief 30,000-foot view of using bibliometrics, different places that you can find bibliometrics, sort of the innards of the Web of Science. I want to stop before we finish up and just see if there are any questions that anyone would like to raise.
Hi, Ricky. I don't see any questions right now in the chat or Q&A, but while folks are thinking about questions they might ask before we conclude, I had a question that I wondered about as you were presenting. Sure. Is there a way to limit the, I guess, the impact factors for based on geography? For instance, if I wanted to look at the reach of something in South America or in the Pacific Islands or in Europe or a particular country, is that a filtering option at all?
Yes, you can restrict along geography both for where particular journals are published. For some metrics, you can also restrict to the location of an institution with which an author is affiliated. Typically don't necessarily know individual country of origin for individual authors. So authors may be associated with more than one institution, and that can make things tricky sometimes. As far as I recall, you can only do it at the country level. I don't think that there's a way to, compare, the southeast of the U.S. with the northwest, for example. Although you could approximate that by selecting the various institutions in those geographic locations that you were interested in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think as we focus on making our research relevant to different audiences, that would be an important filtering factor, depending on where your work is focused or who you're trying to reach. So thank you for clarifying that. And Jessica says Altmetric shows countries.
Yes.
Did you want to expand on that, Ricky?
Yeah, so altmetrics are really interesting because the altmetric systems, because they're based on metadata that is shared. If you think about when you access a system, it's often picking up your internet service provider or some indicator for you. You can see some very interesting altmetrics that show where in the world individuals who are accessing full text documents are located. These are almost like readership metrics rather than citation. So they capture who is clicking through to the full text. If you pull Twitter data out, for example, that is referencing particular studies or particular institutions or whatever it might be that you're interested in, you can derive the same understanding. Where are the different Twitter users located in the country?
Thank you. Any other questions or comments for Ricky before we go through key takeaways? Okay, I don't see any. Ricky, I wondered if, as you review the key takeaways on this topic, if you could also talk about any resources you might direct folks to, or places to go for additional information.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think the key takeaways that I hope people leave with today is that Bibliometrics is using statistical analysis on citations. That has its benefits and also its caveats, that you can find them from a variety of sources. You needn't use the Web of Science, which is a fee-based system. Always important that bibliometrics should be interpreted in connection with other data or knowledge that you have. That these measures can be used to support understanding of the importance or impact of either individual publications or people, or of groups of publications and people, and that they can also be helpful in selecting where to publish or who to work with. So Clarivate Analytics is the company that operates Web of Science. They actually offer a lot of really great resources if you want to learn more, not just resources that describe their own system and how to use it, but also white papers and background information on bibliometrics, including information about some of the metrics that I didn't talk about today, like the citing half-life. Eigenfactor is kind of a nonprofit organization. They offer a similar library of resources on the topic, and their website is still my go-to for the best way to access sort of the underlying statistical science that's used for these metrics. There are also quite a few books on this topic, which you can find at academic institutions. And there's one or two of them I think you can even find as full text online. So if you Google something like Introduction to Bibliometrics, you can find a number of great resources. And finally, it wouldn't be a Ricky Mangrum webinar if I didn't give a plug for instructional videos that are available on YouTube. There are a lot of good ones. The only sort of caveat I'd give to that is it's important to look for recent items because the software really does change so often.
Thank you, Ricky. That was excellent. I've learned so much about this topic, and I appreciate the suggestions for further resources, especially the plug for YouTube videos, which are always helpful to me. Well, that concludes our webinar. So I want to thank everyone for attending today and for your engagement and questions for Ricky. As a reminder, the webinar is going to be available on the MSKTC website as part of our knowledge translation toolkit. And there you'll find, in addition to this webinar and transcript in about a week, several other resources that might help with impacting the reach of your publications and articles. So we have things spanning from disseminating to different audiences to writing for different audiences, or creating products in different formats to further your reach. So if you've not seen our toolkit, I encourage you to check that out as you conduct your work. I think you'll find several of the resources to be useful. Again, I just want to thank Ricky very much for her time today and for you all. I also invite you to give us feedback after you close out of this webinar. A brief feedback form is going to pop up. If you can let us know how you enjoyed today's event and what you'd like to hear in the future from our model system staff and the other folks we work with that might support you in your work. Thank you and have a great rest of the day.